Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Today is September 9th. Please raise your hand or say something in the chat if you remember what the day was like on September 9th, 2020. You remember looking out the window that day? That was the day that the sun did not rise in the Bay Area. That was the day that was covered in smoke. Congratulations to all of us for making it another turn around that sun. And I just want to welcome you all today. So welcome, I'm Annie Burke. I'm lucky to be Together Bay Area's Executive Director, and I'm going to be your host today. As we get started, I want to make visible two things that are often invisible. The first is that we are all on native land, that this place now called the Bay Area has been the home of tribes and bands who for 10,000 years lived in harmony with these lands. We recognize the impact that colonization has had on the lands and the peoples. We honor the Native people living today as well as their ancestors, and we actively work on healing relationships with Native and non-Native peoples and on healing relationships with the land. We also thank the Amamutsan Land Trust, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area, and Segura Tay Land Trust for being members of Together Bay Area and for their participation in shaping this regional coalition. Will you join me right now in the chat in making the Indigenous lands we're all on more visible? Click on that chat button at the bottom and tell us where you are, what Indigenous lands you're zooming in from, what Indigenous language is spoken wherever you are, or if or how you're supporting or partnering with a local tribe or Indigenous group. Jump on over to the chat and let's share and learn together and start the conversation there. While you do that, the second thing I want to make visible is that you all belong here. We welcome all of the difference that is represented in those beautiful Zoom rectangles. No matter who you are, how you identify, how you present, what you do for work, how much money you make, how many family members you live with, what you ate for breakfast, or perhaps what you are eating for breakfast, we welcome you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being you. Thank you for all the things that you're doing to make this a better world. Let me really quickly tell you a little bit about Together Bay Area. We're a regional coalition of nonprofits, Indigenous tribes and groups, and public agencies, all working for climate resilience and equity. We're a small staff of 2 with a bunch of contractors also supporting our operations and programs. Ariana Rickard, our political director, is here today. She raised her hand. So hi, Ariana, and thank you for helping on the back end of this event and all the work that you do. We're governed by a dedicated board of directors, many of whom are here today. If you're here, I can't see all the boxes, so raise your hand, either your Zoom hand or your real hand. And also Together Bay Area is a membership-powered coalition. We have 69 member organizations, and all of those members make this a regional coalition possible and make events like today's possible. So thank you so much for being a part of this. So today we're talking about implementing 30 by 30 here in the Bay Area. So for those who don't know or want a reminder or want to remember what you're signing up for this morning, 30 by 30 is shorthand for Governor Newsom's executive order from October 2020 that sets a goal for conserving 30% of the state's lands and waters by the year 2030. So 30% by 2030. The executive order includes provisions for economic sustainability, food security, biodiversity, climate resilience, and equitable access to the outdoors. What does all of this mean for the Bay Area? And how can our region collaborate on and fast track its implementation? Because we know that the crises that we're facing are big ones and time to act is now. We're going to talk about all that today. Before we jump in though, I just want to set a few points of context. The first is that 30 by 30 is deceptively complicated. It's really easy to understand 30% by 2030. But what it really means and how it's actually going to happen is way more complex. And we'll talk about some of those complexities. We at Together Bay Area see this initiative as an opportunity. There's energy, there's political will, both at the state level with Governor Newsom, but also President Biden, and also a lot of work around the globe. So how do we harness that energy for the region's conservation goals and for climate resilience? That's the way that we're approaching this project or this initiative. With our members, we've identified some critical success factors that we believe will help the state's initiative be successful. Those critical success factors will also help support our regional goals, and we'll talk about those today also. If you were expecting all the answers on this one webinar, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We don't have all the answers. There's a lot happening. The state's initiative is being developed as we speak. So please don't expect our speakers to know everything or to know how it's going to play out. You know, we're participating in this just as you all are. So instead, I invite you to participate in today's conversation and 30 by 30 generally with a collaborative and generative mindset. Let's make something of this. Let's take this opportunity and run with it. So let's jump in. Right now, I want to introduce our first speaker. Moira Tom is program manager for the Bay program of the Coastal Conservancy. Moira has worked on public access and conservation in the region for years, and she has a bird's eye view of what's happening on the ground in the region. And I'm really thrilled to have Moira and welcome you to the stage to provide some opening remarks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Annie, for that really great context. And thank you for inviting the Coastal Conservancy to share in this conversation. I'm delighted to be here today. So let's jump right in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So here we go. Okay, so can everybody see that?
Looks great.
Great, thanks. Okay, so for those who may not be familiar with the Coastal Conservancy, I'll start with a quick overview. And along the way, I'm going to touch on the types of projects we work on and some of our funding programs, and then get into the governor's 30 by 30 goals. Okay, so the State Coastal Conservancy was created in 1976. We're the non-regulatory arm of the state's coastal management program, and the Conservancy's San Francisco Bay Area program is authorized to work within the entirety of all 9 Bay Area counties. So if the Conservancy is non-regulatory, what exactly is it that we do? Well, we largely do projects, and we work under several main themes or categories. And one is habitat protection. For example, this slide up here in the left shows Wild Lake Ranch that the Conservancy helped the Land Trust of Napa County protect in 2006. And that was 3,000 acres, really important habitat and biodiversity corridors. We're also very involved in habitat restoration and enhancement. And finally, public access. That is getting people out to and along and enjoying the shoreline. And one of the ways we do this is through our Explore the Coast program, which focuses on communities who have faced barriers getting to or enjoying the coast. And I just want to note that there's an annual grant round. This year we have actually $14 million, which is a big augment for us, which will help us enable a launch of sort of a new companion coastal stories call. And throughout the slideshow, I've sort of highlighted anything to do with, available funding with these asterisks. Okay, so another main program that we have is Climate Ready. And this work helps communities, both natural communities and human communities, adapt to the impacts of climate change. So projects under Climate Ready seek to address issues like sea level rise and extreme heat. And note that the Bay program is currently running an ongoing grant round that's funded by Prop 68, the Parks and Water Fund of 2018. So another source of funding is through the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. This is a separate regional entity that was created by the California legislature in 2008. Funds to help accomplish the Restoration Authority's mission are generated by Measure AA, which is a 20-year parcel tax that Bay Area voters levied upon themselves in 2016 to fund Bay restoration work. And the Coastal Conservancy helps staff the Restoration Authority along with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. So projects must include a habitat restoration component, and even better if they also contain related flood management or public access elements. Grant round number 5 is underway now. Proposals are due by October 7th of this year. And then there's also an ongoing community grants program. So if you want to know more or apply for funds through this grant round, go to the SFA Restore site and you can get information on how to do that. Okay, so let's get into 30 by 30. So it's coordinated by the California Natural Resources Agency. The process is informed by regional and topical listening sessions that probably many of you have participated in. Those sessions have just been completed, and Resources Agency will release a Pathways to 30 by 30 framework document soon. I checked the website last night. It says it will be released in draft form this fall and finalized by next February. But I'd just like to sort of highlight 2 things that 30 by 30 is supposed to do. It's supposed to use voluntary collaborative action, and it's supposed to strategically prioritize investment. So the executive order also specifies that we need to achieve 30 by 30 in a manner that takes the following considerations into account. So let's just take a look at this list. These things essentially mirror what we as a region have been advancing for years as far as types of projects and efforts. And certainly tribal and indigenous communities have been maintaining relationships with the land since time immemorial. It also mirrors how we've been doing this, i.e. actions are voluntary, collaborative, and strategic. So the 30 by 30 initiative really is sort of a 2-way street. It can help shine the spotlight on and refocus energy on the continued importance and need for our work. And in turn, the Bay Area can offer an example of how to do this using a collaborative approach based on regional conservation and climate goals. So how can the Bay Area serve as a model? Well, 30 by 30 charges us to strategically prioritize investments. The Conservancy has had the opportunity to help support development of 3 science-based regional strategies. So there was the 2015 science update of the 1999 Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals report. And this was of course done in concert with scientists at SFEI and many others. A subtitle Habitat Goals report, and then the Conservation Lands Network, which focuses more on the upland habitat goals and was updated in November 2019, along with funds also provided by the Moore Foundation. And of course, these are extensive collaborations that involved a whole suite of funders, advisors, and authors. And these are not the only underlying documents. There's certainly other regional guiding plans that can underpin 30 by 30. One that comes to mind might be the PCA, the Priority Conservation Areas program that's run by ABAG MTC. So 30 by 30 also emphasizes multi-benefit projects. Coyote Valley is a great example. This is a 7,400 acre area in Santa Clara County between San Jose and Morgan Hill. It has farmland, wildlife, a critical groundwater recharge area, the historic Laguna Seca wetland complex, opportunities for the Bay Area Ridge Trail and other regional trails, and it's a vital linkage between the Santa Cruz Mountains to the west and the Diablo Range to the east. Again, an extremely collaborative project. The Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority spearheaded the effort along with Peninsula Open Space Trust and the city, and local voters passed Measure T. So the Conservancy was able to help acquire one of the parcels necessary to permanently protect part of this valley corridor from the threat of urban sprawl. And I'll just make a shout out to a sister state agency, the Wildlife Conservation Board also was a major funder of that. Another great example is large-scale restoration projects in the region. So 30 by 30 says that nature-based solutions are approaches that protect and restore biodiversity, and it specifically calls out wetland areas. So the South Bay Salt Pond is the largest tidal wetlands restoration project on the West Coast. It will restore about 15,000 acres in 3 locations around the bay. To the north, there's 2,600 acres in the Novato Baylands. The former Hamilton Airfield was restored in 2014, and restoration of the adjacent Belmarine Keys site is underway. And because wetlands act as giant natural sponges, they can be integrated with more traditional flood protection projects, such as the South Bay Shoreline project, which will protect the community of Alviso. And finally, wetland project locations in the Baylands mean that there's opportunity to provide public access, such as via the Bay Trail. So here's an urban example in the city of San Francisco's Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood that received Restoration Authority funds. This site lies between Harrods Head Park to the north and Yosemite Slough to the south. The city just broke ground on this India Basin Shoreline Park, which will transform 10 acres of former industrial brownfields. The park will remediate intertidal areas, restore wetlands, and revitalize a waterfront park. And the site will also serve as an anchor for equitable and inclusive economic growth, guided by a community drafted equitable development plan. And then finally, one of the 30 by 30 advisory panels concluded that, quote, ongoing and active management is necessary for effective biodiversity conservation in a changing climate. So a few slides ago, I said the Hamilton Wetlands Restoration was completed in 2014, but that date is actually just the start. Organizations like Novato Baylands stewards can help address the ongoing hands-on restoration work in concert with job training and community engagement. And note that the 30 by 30 panel specifically called out the need to address invasive species and wildfire. The Invasive Spartina Eradication Project is a good example of how we in the Bay have been tackling this issue on a regional scale, and we're committed to completing it in order to sustain healthy bayland habitats, particularly mudflats. And on the wildfire front, we recently had a special board meeting in June devoted to wildfire resilience actions, and SB 170, the cleanup trailer bill for this year's 21-22 budget, has authorized $5 million to the Bay program for wildfire resilience activities. And this can also incorporate certainly job training and workforce development as well. So moving forward, how might we collectively do this? Senate Bill 155 is another trailer bill that authorizes $350 million to the Conservancy in fiscal year 22-23 and $150 million in the following year. And note these amounts are to the agency as a whole, not just the Bay program. This will still require future action by the legislature to actually appropriate these funds into the Conservancy's budget. But there's an opportunity to work collectively together to prepare a good suite of projects that will really demonstrate outcomes on the resilience, climate change, and conservation fronts. And so I've pulled out some language from the bill. These are some of the things it calls out. But the good news is that it actually appears pretty flexible. Ultimately, we can support projects consistent with the purposes of the Bay Area program. Some of those things that I've just summarized in this presentation. So hopefully this sort of whirlwind tour of the Conservancy has been helpful in thinking about ways that the San Francisco Bay Area program can continue to work with you all as we collectively move forward.
Thank you so much, Moira. A whirlwind is maybe the right word, but the work that you and your colleagues do at the Coastal Conservancy and in the Bay program is so diverse and so inclusive of lots of different aspects of healthy lands and healthy people and healthy communities that really appreciate all the work that you do. And for that overview, the Bay Area would not be what it is today without the Coastal Conservancy Bay program. So thank you so much for that overview.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to bring you back up on stage in a few minutes to ask you some questions. But now what I'd like to do is introduce our other speaker, Mr. Tom Robinson. He is the project lead of the Conservation Lands Network, which he'll tell you about in just a second. He led the development of Conservation Lands Network, or CLN 2.0, in 2016 to 2019, and has a deep knowledge of the nuts and the bolts and the multi-benefit projects and the landscape units of how conservation works here in the Bay Area. He's been involved for many, many years. And so it's my great pleasure to bring Tom onto the stage and for some opening, about 10-ish minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll dive into questions.
There we go. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and
Okay.
now we just need to see you.
Oh, am I?
There you go.
Okay, great. And you can see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annie. And it's such a privilege and an honor to be with everybody this morning. I'm going to keep the whirlwind going and talk to you guys about the Conservation Lands Network and how it relates to the 30 by 30 initiative. The Bay Area is considered a global biodiversity hotspot. And with a growing population and climate change stressors, we need an inspiring vision that focuses conservation efforts. And that sound familiar? That's the source of 30 by 30 initiative. But we have our own 30 by 30 here in the Bay Area, and it's 50 by 50. And that emerged through this Conservation Lands Network process that I get to talk about today. And since our funders, like Moira, who provide the lifeblood for conservation, need measures of success, our region also needs an accounting framework to track and communicate progress. So with that in mind, and the state's 30 by 30 initiative in mind, I think it's important for all Bay Area conservation practitioners to take a moment to learn about the Bay Area Conservation Lands Network and how it not only sets a similarly bold vision of 50% by 2050, but how that vision is backed by data-driven accounting framework to track progress over time. So I'm going to describe for you what the CLN is, what its 50 by 50 goal is all about, and share some thoughts about achieving it while helping the state achieve its 30 by 30 goal. So first off, as Moira mentioned, the CLN joins the Baylands goals and the subtitle goals to form a trio of plans that articulate regional conservation priorities across these three biomes. The CLN is the Upland Habitat Goals Project, and it's been around since the mid-2000s. It's on its second version, as Moira mentioned, which was launched just recently in November of 2019. Kind of feels recently, in some ways it feels like a lifetime ago. And it's always been collaboratively developed. The 2.0 project involved over 150 local experts and practitioners contributing their time and expertise. And it's focused on the upland areas of the 9 counties that touch the Bay, plus Santa Cruz. Now, what's special about the CLN is that it marries a bold vision, bold inspiring vision, with an accounting framework to track progress over time. So the CLN sets a bold goal of 50 by 50 because climate experts tell us that these next 30 years are going to see a lot of change. And this is our time. This is our opportunity to get the house in order for possibly permanent change. This is our window of opportunity to take action while governments and our social systems are not totally consumed with managing that change. But the 50% goal was not plucked out of thin air. The CLN's expert-informed modeling shows that in order to conserve ample representation of all our remaining habitat types and in appropriate amounts, we need to conserve about 2.5 million acres, or half the Bay Area. And our analysis shows that with hard work and over time, based on our trajectory of conservation in the Bay Area, that 50% by 2050 is achievable. Now, the modeling I mentioned is geographic. So it tells us not just to conserve half, but it tells us which half. The half that has the most representation of Bay Area habitats and species in an efficient, connected network that includes the many conservation investments to date, which are shown in green. And the network itself is shown in the various colors of blue there. Let's zoom into this spot near Santa Cruz to kind of to demonstrate this. So the CLN framework is driven by habitat goals set by local experts. And as land is conserved over time, we can measure our progress toward those habitat goals, as well as the regional goal of 50 by 50. And so you can see here that by 2018, when we took a kind of a census of conservation, we achieved our goals for California sagebrush in this region. And just imagine all of the different habitats in all the different regions of the Bay Area, we have this accounting framework for that. And we think this marriage of a big, bold vision and a ground up habitat-based accounting is a winning strategy and one that the state should eventually integrate into 30 by 30. The CLN is not just a regional vision and a measurement tool. It's designed to help local conservation organizations make strategic decisions and to row generally in the same direction. Conservation organizations use the CLN to compare the relative contributions of given properties to those regional habitat goals. And these organizations don't have to have GIS staff on board to make these comparisons. There's an online mapping tool that you can use to generate customized reports based on areas of interest. And as Moira mentioned, the Coastal Conservancy uses the Conservation Lands Network and these conservation portfolio reports, these customized reports for their decision-making as well. So there's lots more about the modeling, the data, other priorities like riparian areas and fish habitat, and the online mapping tool, all at bayarealands.org. And if you have a spare hour, which I'm sure we all do, check out the video that we're going to put in the chat right now. It really dives more deeply into kind of the framework itself. So that's what the CLN is, and that's why it sets the goal of 50 by 50. It's not out of thin air. It's not a catchy phrase. It's what we need to preserve, to have a network, a backbone, if you will, of conserved connected habitats. But here's where the CLN modeling ends and the human decision-making begins. The 50% we achieve here in the Bay Area and the 30% we achieve statewide should be places where benefits to people are stacked high. Here are some key benefits of conservation in the Bay Area. Some of these will look very familiar, and maybe some of these might be new for you. These benefits have their own unique geographic distributions. Not all land recharges groundwater at the same rates, for instance. So as we work toward 50 by 50 here locally, we should not only be conserving an efficient network that represents all habitat types that exist here, but we should conserve first the places from which many benefits flow. And that is the real challenge to calculate. And for this reason, to sort of meet that challenge, a group of regional conservation organizations developed the Bay Area Greenprint. And what the Greenprint does is it vacuums up the CLN data and a host of other data sets that represent nature's values and benefits and displays them all on a map that's also interactive. And I recommend, if you're interested in diving into the geography of how the different values stack up, go to bayareagreenprint.org, but not right now, just make a pin. So all of this is really the bleeding edge, we think. You know, we have all these data, but our next challenge is to look at the Conservation Lands Network through the lens of nature's values and benefits and ask, where are the areas that are generating the most benefit? And ask, where are those areas generating the most benefit to the most vulnerable among us? And this is the key hurdle for 30 by 30, as Moira mentioned, because the executive order and the recommendations from the 30 by 30 expert panels all call for multi-benefit projects that benefit disadvantaged communities particularly. So I want to return briefly to the topic of the bold goals we're talking about today, like 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. And I want to share two thoughts on implementing them. The first, I think the Bay Area and other urbanized regions need to shoot higher than 30%, as we are here in the Bay Area. 50% should be seen as a minimum in places where the landscape is fragmented. Where you have land under pressure of development and where you have lots of people who, knowingly or not, depend on their surrounding ecosystems for their livelihoods, we need to conserve land at higher rates than elsewhere. I realize that it's cheaper to conserve lands where costs are lower, but we need to make sure we're directing resources to places that are biologically diverse and have already been fragmented by human activity, because of that fragmentation, any additional development could mean severing important connections between larger areas. For example, it turns out that the health of carnivore populations on the peninsula, so think bobcats, mountain lions, and others, is highly dependent on migrants from the Diablo and Gavilon mountain ranges. Over time, our development of Coyote Valley, so think southern San Jose, Morgan Hill, Gilroy, have confined migration to a couple of points. And as Moira mentioned, now thankfully, one of the most important points was just conserved by the city of San Jose, working with all of the great open space organizations she mentioned. But this highlights that in urban and urbanizing areas, our options to maintain habitat connectivity and biodiversity health are running thin. And therefore, we need to increase the pace and scale in these areas first. The second thought on implementation of these bold goals is the critical importance of stewardship. Just as Moira mentioned, it's not enough to remove the threat of overt habitat destruction from development. Implementing these conservation visions means restoring habitat function. The more the landscape functions naturally, the more it's resilient to the effects of climate change, and the more benefits flow to people and wildlife. So the CLN is the Bay Area's 30 by 30, and it's been around since the mid-2000s as a collaboration of practitioners and biologists. We have a trio of plans here, and by implementing these plans, we're collectively getting ready for what's to come by actively conserving a network of resilient lands that benefits all members of our community. So as we think about the state's initiative and helping them develop the inner workings of 30 by 30 this year, and as we help it achieve 30% by 2030, let's remember what we're doing. We're conserving a network of lands, and why we're doing it, to be as resilient to climate change as possible, and who we're doing it for. And that is the youth of today and for future generations. And I'll leave you with this statistic. We're expected to welcome another 2 million people to the Bay Area in the next 20 years. So I cannot think of a better time to have these two complementary, bold, and achievable goals in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And there's so much to dig in there. I really appreciate all the work that you do and the way that you communicate a very big and complex project in a way in just 10 minutes. So thank you for that whirlwind tour of Conservation Lands Network. I want to welcome Moira back up onto this, this stage of Zoom sorts. And I want to ask a few questions and get into a conversation with you too. But while we do that, I want to invite all of you who are here watching and participating to tell us who you are, who's here today. We can see your names in the participants, but if you want to say hi in the chat, tell us your name and your organization, and tell us any questions that you have, any ideas or suggestions or things that you're wondering about. I'm going to ask Moira and Tom a few questions, and then I'll be pulling some questions from the chat. I also have some questions that some of you asked when you signed up for this event. So we're going to try to get to have a conversation here. I know it's Zoom, but we're going to do our best. I also know that there's a lot of questions. We all have a lot of questions, so we'll do what we can in the time that we have. So let's start off. One of the most frequently asked questions that I hear about 30 by 30 is, what does conserve mean? So Tom, what does it mean? Or what is the current thinking about it? How do we define conserve in the CLN? And then also I want to add some urgency to that question, in that we don't necessarily have 10, 15 years to really debate what that definition is. The time to act is yesterday. So can you talk a little bit about what that definition means?
Yeah, you bet. So at this point in the evolution of our knowledge and sort of environmental systems, I think of conserve as a two. I think we all think of conserve as a two-sided coin. On one side is preventing overt threats of habitat destruction and land clearing. And on the other is reducing or eliminating the less overt threats, such as invasive species, artificially severe fires brought on by 100 years of fire suppression, and the subtle and not so subtle effects of climate change, like the drying out of vegetation and soil, which we call aridification. So at this point, we recognize you can't have one side without the other. And so in terms of the CLN, we define the conservation as natural and working lands permanently protected by fee title ownership or conservation easement, preventing conversion to uses incompatible with biodiversity conservation. And this works pretty well in our region, where the biggest threat remains land clearing for residential and commercial development. We have a growing population. What's interesting here is that the inclusion of working lands. Farms and ranches, particularly rangeland ranches, house a large proportion of the Bay Area's important habitats and dispersal and migration corridors. But another point here is that the definition that we use for CLN doesn't implicitly mention the second side of the coin, stewardship. I mentioned that the CLN's accounting framework is driven by maps of lands protected via fee title or conservation easement by the region's conservation organizations over time. But the problem is our current methods of collecting those maps do not include a way to capture the degree to which those lands are being stewarded for ecosystem health and resilience to invasives, artificially severe fires, and aridification. So this is a big opportunity to improve the CLN and similar frameworks like 30 by 30. And I would say to your third part, how important is this definition given how little time we have to prepare for the effects of climate change? I would just say, a definition of conserve that includes both protection of overt threats and stewardship of land for ecosystem health is critical to getting the house ready for the effects of climate change.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
And if I could,
can I
please. Maybe just add, thank you, Tom. I think, that really summarizes it well. I would just add too, in thinking about the spectrum from, quote unquote, vast natural lands to urban areas. Sometimes when we think of biodiversity or, conservation, things like, Yosemite images like that crop up. But, I think it really is sort of a network of all kinds of areas. And, given the Bay Area, that includes certainly urban areas and opportunities for urban greening.
Great.
Indeed.
Really is rural, urban, natural, and working lands. This is not just work of open spaces outside of the urban center. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you for raising that.
Mm-hmm.
Moira, I want to come to you and talk about how the CLN meets up with the grant making and support that the Coastal Conservancy does. How does the CLN factor in? How do you look at that? How do you use that? And maybe building on that point you just made about urban areas, how does the CLN and grant making and urban projects all come together?
Yeah, I'd like to just share my screen one more time and show a couple of graphics that might help talk about this. So, so first sort of back to the Coyote Valley example, the Conservation Lands Network really provided the basis for us to make a case for regional conservation. The CLN often underpins more detailed analyses. So we were able to determine the importance of this area by using data from the CLM and analyzing factors like water resources, biodiversity, climate resilience, wildlife connectivity. And then we were sort of able to understand, the piece that we were being asked to consider, which is just that little red circle. How does that fit into the regional context as a priority? What is the greater than local interest? Sort of the importance of investment beyond what resources might be contained just in that one little spot. So that was really, helpful in context setting. Another example I want to share is from one of the other underpinning documents, and that's the subtitle habitat goals. I think it might be sort of the lesser known of kind of the trio of conservation strategies. And so the subtitle habitat goals report has recommendations for various shoreline, intertidal, and subtidal habitat types that occur in different depths, salinity, and temperature ranges. And of course, these are all important for food for fish, spawning, nursery areas, etc. But they also have potential to attenuate wave energy. So we should definitely not forget about submerged areas when we're thinking about approaches to addressing sea level rise. So an example of work that's grown out of the subtitle habitat goals recommendation is living shorelines, basically placing sediment, shell, vegetation to enhance habitat, but also protect the shoreline from erosion. And so the three blue stars on this map show 3 living shoreline locations where we're working with partners: San Francisco State, UC Davis, Smithsonian Institute, Nature Conservancy, East Bay Parks, others, to really test new methods for restoring oyster reefs, eelgrass beds, and marshes. So again, I'm always happy to get to show subtitle examples because I think, recently there was a lot of emphasis on, the Baylands and with the 2015 science update. But, I think, particularly now we need to be thinking about really knitting together, these sort of 3 underpinnings in what we're doing.
Thank you so much. Knitting together is definitely a phrase that I've been hearing a lot. Also, like taking a whole watershed approach from the ridge lines down to the bay. We really need that landscape scale stewardship, landscape scale conservation to address the challenges that we're facing today. I also just want to reflect from both of you, based on what both of you have shared, just how much work is happening in the Bay Area. Like I've been working in this field for a while, and I still am constantly learning about new projects, new collaborations, new ways of approaching, and it's both very exciting and it's also never ending, the learning curve of what's going on. So I'm guessing that there are other people here who might be having that same feeling of, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Or there's also 50 other things that we haven't even mentioned that are also going on. It's really kind of hard to capture it all concisely because there's just so much. Let's go to some urgency. We talked a little bit about, the time to act, the time to plant the tree is 20 years ago. Well, the time to act is many more years ago than 20. And the recent IPCC report, really threw up a code red of that we really need to act. And the good news is that, the point I just made, there's so much already going on, which is great. I want to ask you both, how do we implement more multi-benefit projects? So I'm wondering if the days of just opening up a trail and having it just being a new trail and nothing else, those days are kind of gone. It's a trail that's also being preparing for sea level rise, or it's a trail that's creating jobs in the neighborhood that it's near, or there's just all these other benefits, many benefits to the programs and projects. So how do we implement more? And what do we need in terms of funding, permitting efficiencies, partnerships, culture? Whoever would like to go first, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm happy to go first. I think for me, it's a great question. And it's not, for me, it's not so much implementing more multi-benefit projects. All conservation projects are inherently multi-benefit. Even a project that seems, kind of purely about biodiversity is still, sequestering carbon and producing oxygen and things like that. So to me, it's a strategic. The question is a strategic one. how do we maximize benefits per project? And I think the conservation community is already quite good at gathering up and telling a story about a particular area, just as the great example that Moira just showed of Coyote Valley. But I think we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. The first is find out who the beneficiaries are of your multiple benefits. Conserve those areas whose benefits flow toward communities that don't have the financial resources to go out and secure those benefits for themselves. I think that's something we need to look at. Conservation benefits that save lives in the immediate term are perhaps more important than those that are a ways off. So think flood protection from riparian and Basin restoration, or relief from extreme heat events from urban greening projects, versus say strict public access projects or a carbon sequestration project. Those are both important. Public access is incredibly important for mental and physical health. Carbon sequestration is incredibly important for the planet's health. They're all super important, but we're pretty good at the public access and carbon sequestration thing in terms of figuring that out. Are we doing enough to help the land and waters take care of the most vulnerable populations? And I would just say that, we need to have an awareness of the geographic distribution of benefits. If we're serious about carbon sequestration and forestry, it's good to know the difference in sequestration between an acre of redwood forest and an acre of valley oak savanna, for instance. They're both sequestering carbon, but one is a bit of a sequestration rock star.
The redwoods, just to name that, right?
Bingo. Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Moira?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, thank you, Tom. I think that I would just add, maybe building on what we already have and sort of thinking about the CLN and sort of our next steps with that. So one of the exciting things that, as you know, we're embarking on is to try to get more robust data in the area of sort of urban streams and how that fits in. And so we've just launched, a new partnership with Cal Academy, using sort of the bio blitzes and centering those in some disadvantaged communities, which will sort of, increase hopefully, the suite of people that we are engaging with. It will provide, sort of more of this urban piece that could be more robust, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. And then I think that, also sort of ties in with, the way you said, like who are we working with? Who are the benefits for? And, at the Conservancy, we are really trying to implement our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles. We're updating our project selection criteria right now with an emphasis on sort of early, co-development where possible, and particularly with tribal and indigenous communities. So, I think those are, going to be really important for us as we're moving forward. And then, Annie, to your point about the urgency, the cutting green tape, creating the permitting efficiencies, and sort of, hoping to bring along both pieces, not just sort of the better coordination and communication, which the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, is really doing a great job of promoting, but, just like the permitting pieces, like the statewide general order that's out for review right now, which will, hopefully, underpin these efficiencies and help us actually get, what's needed, into the ground and established in the, the next decade, which we really need to do.
Great, thank you both. Let's get to the questions that we're hearing from folks that are here with us in this space. The first question, it's going to be a two-parter, and the theme is stewardship. The first part is, what role does invasive plant management play in this, and in 30 by 30 and by extension 50 by 50 here in the Bay Area? And the second part is a really easy question. This is a softball, is how do we fund long-term stewardship of lands? I hope everyone's expecting Tom and Moira to have the answer, because I'm sure they do. They've just been sitting on it for years. But I make a little bit of joke, but it is a serious question, and want to. So first part of that question is invasive plant management and what role that plays, and two, how do we fund this? Moira, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I can start with the invasive plant management stewardship kind of question. I was able to sort of touch on that in one of my slides. With the example of really on the regional scale, with the ISB, the Invasive Spartina project. That's been an investment by many for decades. The good news is that region wide, we brought the acreage down 96%. So, we're sort of ready to cross the finish line, but it's one of those things where we need to keep at it. We need to keep doing it, and we're committed to doing it. And I think it goes hand in hand, with the Wetland Restoration, clearly. So I think there are, that we actually have been doing that, and we will, certainly be mindful of other ways in which we can be doing that, particularly on a regional scale. Other stewardship, I mentioned that the Conservancy will be working more on wildfire resilience project support, as with CAL FIRE, many other funding sources, and certainly there's opportunities in sort of in that suite of work for stewardship, and also like job training, skills training, workforce development, and that kind of thing. So I think those are pieces that certainly shouldn't be left behind when thinking about that work.
Great. Before you jump in, Tom, thank you for raising that, Moira, because that's another question that came up, was around workforce development.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing from what you just said, Moira, and from what you shared earlier, Tom, of workforce development's key to this. That the work that we're doing, the collective big we, is part of the region's economy. This isn't a nice to have over on the side. It's really essential to how this region works and can provide jobs and all kinds of economic benefits, as well as the intrinsic values that the work has. So anyway, just want to jump in on that. Tom, you want to talk about?
I would just add to Moira's great comments, just that the management of invasive plants. When you think about the big environmental issues, the big five, invasive plants, invasive species, replacing native species that have evolved in these places is up there. It's up there with toxics and with climate change. And so it needs to be swept away with all of this other momentum. It cannot be at all left behind. All this momentum about conserving land and making sure we have a backbone that we can kind of depend on, a backbone of nature that we can depend on. Controlling, managing invasive species has to be front and center with all of that. And I think the state is funding projects. The California Invasive Plant Council is embarking on work to get a handle on the scope and scale of the problem, looking at modeling of key native species that are at risk. And then how does climate change create or better, more suitable conditions for the spread of particularly invasive species. So it all has to move in the same direction.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. All right, we have one more question that I want to ask based on what I'm seeing in the chat, and then we'll we have a wrap-up question. The first question I want to ask is kind of a mashup of a few different things I'm seeing in the chat around the built environment, about how does 30 by 30, how does the CLN, in terms of how they're implemented, how do they interact with, how do they connect with what we need to do, or what's happening, I should say, and what we need to do for smart growth, for climate change ready cities and urban areas. if you both could talk about kind of that touch point, maybe as it is today and maybe what it could be.
Moira, I'm happy to just chime in first on this. And thank you for bringing up the exciting work that Together Bay Area and the Coastal Conservancy and the California Academy of Sciences is embarking on right now to basically test the theory of conservation lands network in urban areas. We do a bang up job of finding those priority areas outside of urban areas. We quite literally, unless it's a nice big riparian zone moving through an urban area, we quite literally mask those areas out and say, sorry, these don't compare to the core habitat areas elsewhere. And so we need to rethink that. And we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the kind of key scientific question that groups like SFEI with reoaking Silicon Valley, for instance, are asking. And that is, what is the value? Let's go in with the hypothesis that urban forests and urban areas have biodiversity value. And let's test that theory. We're going to do that. And I just to add one more piece to that, and that is that nature in and near urban areas, the built environment, is perhaps some of the most important nature from a people standpoint on the planet. The moment we have a remnant patch of natural land within an urban area, that's the most important natural area around for people. And as extreme weather events and heat events increase in frequency, we're going to need those areas and more. And so I would just give a shout out to the Sonoma County Ag and Open Space District and the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority, who both have, as part of their tax-funded programs, they have urban-focused programs that fund urban open space. So all of this also needs to increase our understanding and also our action, our conservation action within urban areas.
Thank you, Tom.
I mean, I totally agree. And, just sort of thinking about urban areas in terms of, as you were saying, Annie, with multi-benefit, urban greening, green infrastructure, I think that there's just such potential for really, expanding, a whole network of green space that is multi-benefit, that handles, flooding, groundwater recharge, recreation, having a close place to walk in your neighborhood. I think that all links together. And it's just thinking of it sort of more holistically and, helping to, create sort of those networks within urban areas.
Right. Thank you. All right. It's 10:59. Real quick, Moira and Tom, if you could tell folks listening here and watching this online later, to do one thing, what would you ask them to do? Knowing that in the audience are a range of different people in different roles in different agencies, but what's one thing that you'd like them to do, to take one action that you invite them to take? Moira, you want to go first?
Moira?
Wow. Well, I guess I would encourage people, to sort of maybe step back from where you are and take sort of a broader, sort of more regional view. Sometimes I think it's hard to see progress, or to, like, we're all so busy and we're all in the details of, what we're doing day to day, but, to really think about how this is playing into sort of the regional context. And then, today we're talking about 30 by 30 and a statewide goal. So just sort of taking that time to sort of check in and see how we're integrating, and to really recognize progress towards that, and then sort of recalibrate in thinking about moving forward.
Sounds great.
I agree. I would say have hope. There's so much good work going on. Get involved. There's a Friends of group in your neighborhood. Could be a Friends of group of your local stream, a local open space preserve, or a state park. Get involved, pull some non-native weeds, help just get dirty. It's time.
That's great. Thank you both. I just add also to take care of yourselves. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to think about, a lot to do, a lot to worry about. And there's a whole lot of hope to build on what you just said, Tom. There's a whole lot of good work happening in the region. You all are doing it. So please take care of yourselves. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Moira and Tom for their time today and all the work that they do. If you can join me with a thank you in the chat, or if you want to use the reactions, or if you want to wave with your hands, whatever it is. Really appreciate, Moira, you and all the work that you do at the Coastal Conservancy, and Tom, all the work that you do with the Conservation Lands Network and groups around the region. So thank you both. It's a real pleasure. And thank you, Ariana, for helping with the Zoom stage manager. Really appreciate you. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for being in this conversation, for asking good questions, for doing the work that you're doing. Please take care of yourself. Please have hope. And please take that big zoom out every once in a while and look at that bigger scale, because there's a lot happening. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.